Okay. Are we ready to start?
Yeah, we can go live now.
Cool. My name is Anna-Ruth. I'm going to be doing a lecture today, which is like an introduction to disability and the disability rights movement, and how that can be relevant to debating. So we're going to talk about what disability is, what the kind of like models of disability are, and how that affects the way that disabled people view themselves, or the way that they do their activism. And then I'm going to talk about kind of the history of or kind of overview of discrimination that's happened against disabled people in the past, and then how the disability rights movement has changed that. And then I'm just going to talk about what the kind of legal state is of protections for disabled people across the world, and just talk about what the kind of major issues that face disabled people are right now. After that, then I've got some examples of some motions, and we can talk about how knowledge about disability would be relevant in discussing those motions and potentially help you. And then obviously I can answer any questions that people have. So starting first then, just maybe an introduction to kind of what is disability. So there's a few things that fall under the umbrella of disability. I would just like to clarify that these are examples and they're not necessarily an exclusive list. There are potentially other conditions or things that can happen to people that maybe don't fall explicitly into these categories, but I think broadly these are the categories that cover most areas of disability. So it could be things like physical impairments, like being a wheelchair user, or an amputee, or something like that. Or it can also be things like long-term health conditions, so diabetes and epilepsy and lupus, conditions that can cause, say, chronic pain or fatigue, that kind of thing. Mental health conditions, so the examples we have are like depression, or anxiety, or bipolar disorder, and then, you know, being blind or visually impaired or deaf. And then also neurodivergences, so that's things like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, neurodevelopmental disorders kind of fall under that category. Generally, what we expect is that these conditions are long-term and that they generate some kind of activity limitation in the kind of world as it exists now. When we talk about models of disability, we can kind of characterize what that activity limitation might be and how that's explained and what that looks like. But generally, if we took a view that, you know, being completely able-bodied and neurotypical was the norm, then it would be some kind of impairment to that norm. What I would say is that these conditions can be something that fluctuate and change over time. So for example, if someone has epilepsy, they may go through periods of time where they have a number of seizures and thus would potentially identify as disabled because that is something that is a disabling experience, but then may be, you know, well medicated later on and potentially not identify with disability as much because they are less affected by their condition in their daily life and they have significantly less of an activity limitation. So I think the limitations that disability can cause for people, or the effects of like differences from the able-bodied neurotypical norm, can be different and can change over time, and they can form, you know, different symptoms and things as well. The other thing is that a disability does not have to be something that is visible or obvious to other people. So I think generally when we think of disability, we have an idea that it is someone in a wheelchair, someone who is an amputee. These are the pictures of disability that are often characterized. I think this means that people often forget that people who experience, for example, mental health conditions or long-term health conditions like diabetes can also experience disabling effects of those conditions and also experience things like a lack of accessibility and other discrimination that disabled people face. So just because it doesn't fit into the stereotypical idea of disability, which is something that would be visible and very obvious to other people that that person is disabled, it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have a disability or even that their disability is like less bad or anything like that. In general, I would say that around 15%, which is around 1 billion people of the global population is disabled. This is a statistic that comes from the World Health Organization. The number and the percentage of people that are disabled varies using different ways that you measure it, because obviously it depends how you count it. If you count the number of people with medical diagnoses, then you might get a higher number. If you count the number of people who would actively say that they experience disability, then that is not necessarily, that might be a lower number, for example. The other thing is that just like other social justice movements, disabled people and the disability rights movement are not a monolith. They don't necessarily have exactly the same views or exactly the same experiences. I think it's fairly intuitive to say that someone who is blind has a very different experience from someone who has a mental health condition, and then also has a very different experience from someone who is a wheelchair user. So obviously the differences in experience and opinions and so on can come from the different types of disability that people have. And that notably means that the kind of discrimination that people face is very diverse across disabled people as an entire group. But also note that disabled people experience other marginalizations as well, and they experience differences that come from, for instance, their age or gender, or their sexuality or their race, and that affects their experiences of disability. So an example would be disabled people are highly likely to experience police brutality. Black people are also more likely to experience police brutality. So for Black disabled people, that might be something that is a very important issue, where it might not be for white disabled people. Just some kind of other notes. There are lots of conditions that I've kind of characterized here that are classified as disabilities because they have disabling effects. But that doesn't necessarily mean that every individual that has those conditions is someone that will identify themselves as a disabled person. I think there's a few reasons for this. That would be, number one, that they don't necessarily experience what the disabling effects of those conditions are. So like we talked about with fluctuating conditions, but also for things like lifestyle. So I think, for example, there are lots of people who have dyslexia who don't go on later in life to identify as someone who is disabled with it, probably because they just choose, career path or make lifestyle choices that mean that, reading, for example, is not something that is important to them. So they don't experience the disabling effects of their condition as often or in a way that necessarily causes significant impact on their life. Another reason is that they just might prefer a narrower term. So I think there are lots of people who have certain disabilities who just prefer to identify with the name of that disability or some other characterization. So an example would be someone might want to identify as autistic, or they might want to identify as chronically ill, and they might not choose disabled as a label just because they prefer a narrower term to describe their experience. And then thirdly, it's important to remember that disabled people are marginalized, and disability is something that is viewed negatively. I think people might choose not to identify with disability because it's an attempt to not experience that marginalization, especially if they have a disability that is something they can hide. That doesn't necessarily mean they don't experience the marginalization of their disability. In fact, to some extent, they might experience it more. Number one, just because if they're not actively identifying with their disability and they don't declare it and they're potentially trying to hide it, then they're less likely to do things like ask for accommodations or be proactively offered them. So adjustments and accessibility that they need is less available to them, and that has a negative effect. But also just in general, like hiding a part of yourself, like any other part of your identity, is something that is emotionally difficult, but also for some disabilities can be physically difficult. So an example is I have chronic fatigue, and I could go multiple days without, taking the rest breaks that I need as an adjustment for my chronic fatigue to hide that I have chronic fatigue from other people. But the effect is that I would be much more unwell later on. And so that is something that can be a negative effect. Cool. Let's talk about the different models of disability then. the two models that we're going to talk about, the two kind of main ones, are the social model of disability and the medical model of disability. There are other models of disability, but they are mainly adaptations or add-ons to either of these models. So an example would be there is an affirmative model, and it basically adds on to the social model and an affirmation of the difficulties that disabled people experience that don't fit in with the social model. Okay, so let's talk about the medical model then. So the medical model says that people are disabled by the impairment or the specific medical condition or difference that they have. It means that the difficulties they face are caused specifically by that impairment and by them having that condition. So generally a focus is put on curing that condition or providing treatment and fixing the person rather than accommodating the extra needs that they have. Under the social model, we say that people are disabled by the barriers that exist in society, not a specific impairment or condition that people have. The difficulties that disabled people face then under this model are generally caused by external factors, which are things like inaccessibility or discrimination that disabled people experience, and a focus is put on removing those barriers in society. I think that a good example of where this difference lies is that under the medical model, the fact that I have astigmatism and I wear glasses is something that could be classified as a disability because it is a physical impairment that I have to my vision. Whereas under the social model, because that is a disability that is generally well accommodated for in the world and isn't something where I experience the effects of inaccessibility or discrimination, for example, because glasses are widely available to me, at least in my country, that is something then that is probably not classified as a disability because that kind of discrimination isn't there. So let's talk about then what the kind of pros and cons of these models are. So talking about the social model, the general pros of the social model is that it specifically focuses on people's attitudes and actions and preventing discrimination. So what this means is that it is useful as a political way to characterize that the blame does not exist with disabled people, and that is a motivator to encourage people to improve things like accessibility, because the people and the society that creates inaccessibility is what creates the impairment for disabled people, and that makes it their fault. The other thing is that it strives to include people in the mainstream. So the goal of the social model is to adapt society in its entirety to be completely accessible and discrimination-free for disabled people, such that they don't have any activity limitations compared to non-disabled people. And the kind of last pro is that it doesn't paint the disabled person as a problem. I think obviously a lot of disabled people experience negative emotional effects with feeling like they are, defective or broken, or that there is something wrong with them. Whereas this model specifically characterizes that that isn't an issue with you, that is an issue that exists with other people. The cons then of the social model is that it doesn't generally accurately describe all of the experiences of disability. So an example is, I have chronic pain, but I also have a mobility problem. If the world was made perfectly accessible and discrimination-free, then that would account for my mobility problem because I would be able to get into buildings and do things like normal in that way. But I would still wake up every day with chronic pain, and I would still feel upset and experience difficulty with that. And there's nothing necessarily that other people can do to change that internal experience that I have. So the issue that exists with the social model is that internal experience isn't necessarily characterized as something that is disabling, because it's not something that exists in society. It is something that exists within you. That is an impairment that you experience, and that isn't necessarily characterized under that. The second thing is that removing the kind of pity that the medical model puts on disabled people is something that can be seen as a political demotivator. So in general, in the past, the motivation that people have, for instance, to provide social welfare programs for disabled people comes from the fact that we view them as impaired and unwell and in need of help, and and broken and so on and so forth. And that is something that makes people pity disabled people and, want to provide them this kind of help. Whether that's the correct kind of help is something that's up for debate, but that is something that motivates those kind of social welfare programs. When the social model is used and the emphasis isn't on pitying disabled people or seeing them as broken, but on accepting issues that you as a non-disabled person perpetuate, the difficulty that exists is that you don't necessarily feel sorry for those disabled people anymore, because there's no intrinsic pity that is associated with them. And in general, when we've seen moves to the social model from disabled people organizations, we've also seen moves in austerity that specifically limit the welfare that is available for disabled people because of that. Then talking about the medical model. So the pros that exist of the medical model is that because there is a focus on medical treatment, and for some conditions, medical treatment helps, that is something that people quite like, right? So cancer is something that is disabling. I think most people would want to treat their cancer or cure their cancer if they could. And that is something that is incredibly validating under the medical model. It's something they can do. And that constant motivation for medical treatment to be researched and provided is something that helps those people. And the other pro of the medical model is that because it specifically says it's an impairment that exists with you, and it doesn't focus on necessarily putting you in the mainstream, but just on dealing with your impairment as an individual, then you can get more targeted and specific resources and support. So an example of this is that if you were working under the medical model and you had, for example, a learning disability, then under the social model, they would try to put you in a mainstream school and provide adaptations to you in that mainstream school. The difficulty is that is something that can be quite difficult. And in some cases, the mainstream school environment is just not something that is compatible with certain disabilities. Under the medical model, you might be more likely to be in a segregated school for disabled people, but you are more likely to get very specifically targeted support. And this also then extends to things like physio and so on that exists for people with physical disabilities as well. The support is specifically targeted at you and your very individual needs, rather than generally helping disabled people in society. The cons that exist then of the medical model is, just like the social model, is that it doesn't accurately describe all of the experiences that disabled people face. So it is, again, true, like I said before, that I experience chronic pain and that's an internal experience and so on and so forth. But the vast majority of problems that I experience as a disabled person come from me attempting to seek accessibility and having that refused, and the difficulties that extend from that, and discrimination and things like that. So the problem that exists with the medical model is that it doesn't really describe that or characterize that as an experience that disabled people have. The second issue that exists with the medical model is that it paints disability as the problem. It paints a specific impairment that the individual has as a problem, and thus is more likely to paint that individual as a problem. This is something that potentially has negative emotional effects for those individuals, but it is also a problem in general, insofar as when we paint disability as a problem in society, that is something that enforces people's negative misconceptions about disability and about disabled people and about the fact that they might be defective or broken or there's something wrong with them and so on. And that kind of enforces the kind of discrimination and the difficulties and the stigma that is associated with disability. The final con then is that the focus on cures and treatment, while useful for some people, is something that quite a lot of disabled people do not want. So an example would be is that generally people with Down syndrome think that it is a kind of what's the word, like reasonable neurodiversity that exists. It's just part of the human experience, and they think that it's not necessarily something that we should strive to cure or eradicate. They are happy living with that, and so on and so forth. This is something that that group of people generally believe. This is something that also extends, like, generally autistic-led communities don't see autism as something that necessarily needs to be cured, even if they think there are potentially some treatments or things that could be helpful to them. When we use the medical model and there is a focus on cures, that is potentially imposing that kind of thing that those groups do not want, and obviously that is a negative experience for them. So then just finally, the social model is something that you are likely to see disabled people's organizations use. So these are organizations that are led by disabled people and specifically focus on advocacy and promoting the rights of disabled people and the disability rights movement. They are most likely to use a social model. It was something that was thought up to further the disability rights movement and the idea of disability that those people had. The medical model is something that you are most likely to see medical providers and governments use, for example, to administer social welfare and benefits. So they would ask you for, proof of your diagnosis and so on, rather than potentially a, list of your needs or the difficulties and inaccessibility that you face, which would be what disability would be characterized as under the social model. In reality, however, it is unlikely that an organization in the status quo currently uses a pure medical or social model of disability. They probably use some mixture. So there are a few governments who use kind of purer medical models of disability in the way that they apply certain benefits. Off the top of my head, I think Greece is one of them. So specific diagnoses and specific notes from doctors are what describes your level of disability and the level of benefits and welfare and support you can get, etc. But in general, governments and organizations don't really use a pure medical model, and disabled people's organizations don't really use a pure social model, obviously because cons exist of both of them, and a mixture is probably more likely to describe the experience of disabled people accurately. So an example for this is that if you are assessed for personal independence payment in the UK, the eligibility for that is based on your medical diagnoses. So you've got to provide a ton of medical proof before you get an assessment, but the amount of money that you're assessed for is supposed to be based on addressing specific needs that you have, which is more like something that would happen under the social model of disability and not addressing your specific condition. So that's an example of where they would kind of use mixed models to do this. And that is something that is possible and that happens frequently. Let's go on then to an overview then of the disability rights movement and the kind of historic experiences of disabled people. So firstly, generally prior to the Second World War, it was standard that disabled people were either institutionalized or segregated, and often they were also subject to very significant stigma. And we see, this in, for example, freak shows, which were something that were previously quite common and often mocked disabled people. Note that the institutions that disabled people were held in were not like nice care homes that accounted for all their needs. They were often places that were abusive and were to some extent more like a prison rather than somewhere that caters for your needs. It wasn't about allowing them necessarily to fulfill anything in their life. It was just about putting them outside of society. The other thing is that many disabled people, particularly people with intellectual disabilities, would also be kept in mental asylums. And I think that gives you a better image then of how abusive some of these institutions were. At the beginning of the 20th century, there was a rise in the eugenics movement. And what this led to was increased pushes for negative policies that affected disabled people and pushed them further outside of general society. So this is things like forced sterilization, enforced segregation, and then unfortunately as well, things like mass murder. A significant number of the laws that enforced this kind of thing were not repealed until very late on. So an example is a forced sterilization law that existed in the US was not repealed until the 1970s. So these laws existed for a very long time, and they had large effects, and they were something that were seen as very acceptable for a very long time. An example then, if we think about what the ugly laws in the US were, so these were laws that outlawed disabled people, particularly those with physical deformities or people with intellectual or learning disabilities. It outlawed them appearing in public. So they weren't allowed to be in public places. And this was something that started in the 1800s. Then in the 1900s, alongside those ugly laws, many states also enacted laws like forced sterilization and restricted marriage with the goal of breeding disability out of society. So disabled people would not be allowed to marry non-disabled people. They would often be subject to potentially abusive medical procedures with the goal of sterilizing them. In the UK, around the same time, there was the Mental Deficiency Bill and the Feeble-Minded Control Bill. These were both things that were supported by a number of people in the government, including people like Winston Churchill. So what the Mental Deficiency Bill did was it required people that they considered to be mental defectives to be removed and sent to colonies that they had built specifically for disabled people. So these were towns that had, some very limited, or not really towns, but like locations that had some very limited services where only disabled people would live, and like disabled people had to go there. This was also to take them out of prisons and poorhouses so that they weren't even allowed to be in the kind of institutions that otherwise disadvantaged non-disabled people would be in. They had to be in their own institutions. Around 65,000 people were sent away to these colonies under this policy. And the Feeble-Minded Control Bill was something that, again, restricted marriage for disabled people. And then kind of the unfortunate and I guess most prescient example is that during the Nazi government, Hitler enacted a law which was called the Law for the Prevention of Hereditary Diseased Offspring. And what they would do is sterilize disabled children in hospitals, and they encouraged parents to do that. So under that law, there are around 360,000 forced sterilizations, normally of disabled children, but also of some disabled adults. And then what that went on to was at the beginning of the Holocaust, they began gassing disabled people. And then eventually they were also killing disabled people through other means like neglect and things like that. And so we think that there were around 250,000 to 300,000 disabled victims of the Holocaust, but it's somewhat unclear because obviously at the same time, under the Nazi regime in various places, disabled people who were previously in institutions were also dying because of neglect and things as well. So I think that gives you an idea of how powerful these kind of laws and these discriminatory actions were and how just vastly they've affected disabled people in the past. But also I think it's important to say that it's in the very near past. This isn't something that happened a very long time ago. After the First World War then, when some soldiers came back and they had physical disabilities or things like shell shock, they began to experience, rather than things like institutionalization and segregation, things like rehabilitation and treatment and support in the community. However, at that point in time, that was something that only really extended to soldiers and wasn't something that extended to disabled civilians who were continuing to experience that kind of segregation. After the Second World War, however, when it became clear just how significant the Holocaust was, and how significant that policy that was enacted by the Nazi government had harmed disabled people, eugenics and eugenics-based policies were much more opposed. And at that point, things like forced sterilization and segregation were things that began to be repealed, and were generally moved away from. And there was a move to taking disabled people out of institutions and things like that after this point. At this time then, the disability rights movement became a significantly more active movement, and there were more protests and more campaigns that were specifically led by disabled people or disabled people's organizations. At this point in time, this was something that then led to the fall of segregation and of the institutionalization of disabled people and greater legal protections for them. So an example for this is that there was the independent living movement. This happened kind of worldwide, but was mostly centered in the UK, where disabled people generally moved to have the government abolish the institutionalization that disabled people face and move towards completely dealing with disabled people in the community. And that was part of how many disabled people left institutions. A specifically notable example of the disability rights movement and of how it has enacted change is from the US. So the civil rights movement that existed in the US for Black people and Black people's rights was something that inspired disabled people to organize for their rights afterwards. So the 504 sittings was a protest that happened in April in 1977. And what happened was disabled people occupied federal buildings to ensure that regulations to enact Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act were passed. What these regulations would create was meaning that disabled people would not be allowed to be discriminated against in federally funded programs across the US. So that meant that, for instance, states and welfare benefits and housing and so on would become much more open to disabled people. The notable thing about this sit-in is just how difficult you can imagine that it would be to do, because there were specific physical barriers, like a number of the people in this sit-in had physical disabilities and they were wheelchair users or they had other issues, and they slept on the floor in this building for multiple nights. They had to be carried up and down the stairs. There weren't necessarily like adapted bathrooms and things like that available to them. So if you can just think, like, as a disabled person, potentially how difficult that would be and how significant that organizing was. From then on in America, continued organizing from disabled people and the disability rights movement there led to the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is known as the ADA. And this is something that's probably like the most robust legal protection for disabled people that exists in the world currently. So it mandates things like accessibility, but it also it provides legal protections not just in federally funded programs, but more across the board in things like education and in things like private buildings and so on and so forth. Let's then talk about what the state is of disability rights and the law globally for disabled people. 2 seconds. So firstly, most countries recognize some kind of legal protections for disabled people. What differs is the extent of those legal protections and how well they are enforced. So, for example, some of these legal protections take the form of welfare programs or hate crime legislation or laws that mandate certain kinds of accessibility or things like education provision. However, even the most robust legislation, things like the ADA, is something that has significant enforcement flaws and is often likely to not be well enforced and not necessarily fully implemented. So for example, the way that the ADA pursues accessibility is that it allows disabled people to sue organizations in the civil courts if they don't provide accessibility to disabled people in their business. The difficulty is that this is obviously something that is very difficult for disabled people to do, specifically because they are more likely to experience financial harm, and thus it is something that doesn't happen often. And so a number of businesses and organizations in the US continue to discriminate against disabled people and promote inaccessibility. And this is something that is an issue that exists in most of the legislation that covers accessibility across the world. Secondly, there is the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This is something that's been ratified by 180 states and also the EU, and then there's also a number of states that have signed it but not ratified it. What it calls for is efforts to prevent disability discrimination, ensure accessibility and the right to work, and provide social protections and welfare. It also specifically prohibits previously very discriminatory practices that disabled people experienced, like compulsory sterilization, and it also requires that a state recognizes a person's legal capacity, empowers them to make their own decisions, and allows them to do things that other people would do, like voting, and so on and so forth. If we have a look at this map, we can see that the take-up of this particular convention is particularly widespread. And I think this highlights just how significant the global take-up of at least some kind of legal protections for disabled people is, and the fact that this, some level of legal protections exists across the world. I think it's obvious to say that this is something that is a convention, and thus the UN committee can only make recommendations to states, but doesn't really enforce the convention. But what I think it shows is that a number of states are willing to and are taking steps to enforce some kind of legal protections, even if that isn't completely robust or full coverage. Okay then. So just to give some kind of closer examples of what these kind of legal protections look like and what the states of them are. So Europe generally has pretty strong disability legislation, but there still exists some kind of major issues that exist for disabled people. So for example, the UN committee that I previously mentioned investigated the UK for grave and systematic human rights violations against disabled people in response to changes to social welfare and benefits. So what they did was they changed the assessment procedure for personal independence payment, and that meant a number of disabled people were no longer eligible for the benefits that they had received in the past and thus experienced significant financial harm. They also changed the assessment procedure for things like social care. So disabled people stopped having their carers, for example, and they also closed this thing called the Independent Living Fund, which was something that helped fund like adaptations and carers that particularly severely disabled people needed to live in the community. So the UN committee that investigated them decided that this was human rights violations, and this was quite significant and was a particularly harmful move by the government at the time. And they produced their report, but the UK government rejected all of those recommendations. I think it's really important to say that the UK government was the first, and as far as I'm aware, currently the only country that's been subject to such an investigation by the UN. But I think it's reasonable to say then that, even where we have quite robust legal protections for disabled people, like they have in the Equality Act in the UK, these kind of human rights violations still occur through other policies that governments implement, things like social welfare and so on. So just more generally, even if legislation does protect disabled people, again, there's still issues that exists with things like underinvestment in the public sector, which is the kind of thing that operates these protections. So for example, if there is a lack of investment in schools, but we are expecting schools to provide costly educational support for people with learning disabilities, then the difficulty exists that they are probably unlikely to offer that support if they don't have the full funding. And then also we can mandate that when we build new pavements and infrastructure like roads and so on and so forth, that we make those accessible to disabled people, to make towns accessible and so on. But if local authorities don't have the money to upkeep their infrastructure and keep it safe and so on and so forth. That legal protection doesn't mean anything because that infrastructure doesn't exist for them. In some cases, there is generally legislation across Europe that mandates like some kind of physical accessibility for buildings and so on and so forth. But for quite a few cases, it only applies to the public sector and not private buildings. This is the case in Ireland and Serbia. So what that means is the government and state buildings are accessible, but it continues to be that private businesses, so shops, restaurants, etc., continue to be allowed to be inaccessible. And thus disabled people still can't really fully participate in, society within their country. Another issue that exists is that things like government websites or documents or statements that they make, a notable example is in the UK, every day they did a coronavirus press briefing, but they never had an interpreter for people who spoke British Sign Language. So a lot of government information and information that states provide to their citizens, things that you need to access things like benefits or know about the situation that's happening in your country, isn't produced in a way that is accessible and that allows disabled people to understand it and engage with it. And thus, disabled people have specific difficulty accessing things like public services and understanding emergency situations and so on in their country. Yeah. Okay, then let's talk about and I think this is probably the most important part, the major issues that currently face disabled people are. And so firstly, and I think this is the one that people generally know, the major issue is accessibility. So disabled people often don't have equal access to information, for example, because websites are inaccessible or there aren't captions on the television, that kind of thing. They don't have equal access to services or the physical environment, for example, because buildings are inaccessible and accommodations aren't offered to them. Even if you have legal protections that say that I have equal access to education, or I'm equally allowed to vote, or equally allowed to be employed, or so on. The difficulty that exists is that if that building or the information that allows me to do that is not accessible to me, I still cannot do those things. So you can say that I have equal access, but that doesn't actually play out if I can't get into the building. So this is something that continues to harm disabled people's well-being, but also their ability to just generally participate in society and do the kinds of things that we expect people to do. Secondly, then, there are issues that exist around intolerant views and ideas. So disabled people are often viewed as lesser or completely incapable. And in some communities, it's unfortunately true that being disabled is seen as a punishment or as an act of God. And thus, disabled people are often segregated, they experience hate crime and social exclusion, and they experience, issues with their welfare in that sense. Another example then is there are specific disabilities that also face stigmas more generally. So for example, physical deformities are something that are often made fun of, but also a good example is the stigmatization of mental health conditions that exist, like schizophrenia. This kind of stigma and isolation is something that prevents people from doing things like accessing healthcare because they don't want to go and be diagnosed with a disability or declare their disability. And it also causes them problems accessing other services then, even if there are protections that are legally enforced for them, because it is just socially uncomfortable or not allowed by individuals, even if it's allowed by the government. Thirdly, then, is the issue of institutionalization and guardianship. So this is something that leads to like a lack of personal enfranchisement for disabled people, a lack of control over their own life. And it's something that happens both formally, i.e. something that is imposed by the state or like an institution like the state, or informally, because disabled people are reliant on their families and carers. So those people can often easily take control over things that disabled people need to have personal enfranchisement. So an example is if someone needs a carer to leave the house or needs a carer to do things like read menus and things that you encounter to you, that gives them a significant amount of control. If you need someone to read the ballot you are voting on for you, they control your vote. And this is something that creates significant issues for disabled people who are highly likely to be abused and controlled by their family members or their carers. But in terms of formally, this is often done through things like sectioning under the Mental Health Act, or imprisonment, or something like guardianship would exist in the US. So guardianship is the issue. If you've read about Britney Spears, Britney Spears is under guardianship. Her father is her guardian legally in the US. And what guardianship is when the state or the court basically gives certain powers of your legal capacity, so things like control of your money, whether you can vote, control of your medical decisions, all the way up to things like, can you leave the house? Can you drive a car? Can you buy small things, have relationships with people? The state gives control of that to someone else because they think that you don't have the capacity to make those decisions yourself. This causes some issues insofar as even if something like a practice of forced sterilization for all disabled people is banned by the state, something like guardianship is often used to still do these things. So an example would be if a person who, for instance, was intellectually disabled wanted to have a child, something that happens reasonably frequently in the US is that the court might determine that that person couldn't make the decision to have a child and thus put them under guardianship. And that person can force them to have some kind of medical treatment, like, for example, long-acting contraception, to specifically stop them having a child. So things like forced sterilization and so on can still happen, even if they're technically against the law under these kind of things. Yeah. Cool. So the next thing is a lack of access to things like social welfare. So because disabled people experience difficulties accessing work, but also because they have significantly increased costs because of their accessibility. I have a mobility aid, and this surprises most people, but they're not provided by the hospital. You have to pay for them yourself, and they can be thousands of pounds, right? So disabled people experience significantly increased costs of managing their disability as well, and particularly in places where healthcare comes at a cost. What this means then is disabled people are often relying on the government for money, and for housing and things like that. And so the general acceptance of very limited social welfare and benefits and so on. For example, both in the UK and in the US, disability benefits are below the poverty line, but quite significantly the amount that you would get in a year. This means then that disabled people disproportionately experience things like poverty and then all of the harms that come from them experiencing poverty. Next is just generally that there is a lack of platforming of disabled voices in society and in the media. So a large proportion of the major disability charities that you might know, so if you live in the UK or Ireland, Scope, or Autism Speaks is maybe a more global example. These charities are often not led by disabled people themselves. They're often led by non-disabled people. What this means is that they often have differing views on disability. So for example, they're more likely to think that disability is a burden on carers and prioritize all of their advocacy on supporting carers and not on supporting those disabled people in things like accessibility, so they didn't need a carer as much. They are more likely to promote things like searching for cures, even if the disabled people themselves don't want that. This is then reflected in the way that we see disability on television and discussed in politics. So discussion of disability is often framed from the view of carers of disabled people, and things that we need to do for carers and how difficult it is to care for disabled people rather than the harms that disabled people themselves are experiencing. Similarly, like when we see disability depicted in the media, it's often in a very negative light. It's often in a light where it's significantly like there's characterized as a lot of suffering and things like that, but that doesn't necessarily reflect the way that disabled people experience their disability themselves. So this leads to a lot of the things that disabled people want being much less likely to be implemented. So an example is something like inspiration porn, which is basically when when someone says that I'm just inspirational for just managing to exist because of my disability or doing something perfectly normal with my disability, and then non-disabled people use that as inspiration for them to like do normal things in their life. This is something that is quite patronizing. It's something that generally disabled people dislike, but it's something that is often promoted in society and in the media as like disability representation because of that. In terms of a more like kind of policy issue, something like cochlear implants is an example. So the deaf community generally see deafness as something that doesn't necessarily need to be cured, because things like sign language exist that allow disabled people to participate in life fully if they are deaf. And there also exists, unique cultures for deaf people because they speak sign language together and they socialize together and so on and so forth. The rise of cochlear implants is often something that non-deaf parents choose to give to their deaf children. And they often do this at a very young age before that child can make the choice. And the reasoning for that is often that they think it would be isolating for them to learn sign language or to have to only communicate with other deaf people. Or something like that. The problem is that cochlear implants they don't give you perfect hearing, and there's something that a lot of deaf people who have had them describe in a particularly negative fashion. They were not something that they liked having. They cause them a lot of problems because they don't like filter out background noise and things like that. And because they didn't have a perfect hearing experience, they still required things like sign language and other tools that deaf people need to communicate. The difficulty exists that because they were given a cochlear implant as a child with the idea that they would be hearing, they were often not taught things like sign language or given access to those things, and thus they have a significant disadvantage later on. So the deaf community generally opposes cochlear implants, but carers of deaf children who are hearing generally support it because they have this idea that they want their children to be hearing. So this is something where a significant difference exists in the action that people want to take, depending on whether you are a disabled person or a non-disabled carer. The next issue is just generally a lack of access to healthcare. So this can be because of cost or the lack of universal coverage. Healthcare is obviously something that many disabled people need more because they're more likely to have medical conditions and issues like that. But also disabled people experience discrimination in healthcare. They're potentially likely to have medical problems attributed to their disability. They're not their disability carelessly by doctors, and that can lead to them to have greater problems later on. And doctors generally don't necessarily respect the decisions that they make medically, and so on and so forth. And this creates a lack of access to healthcare. And then there's employment discrimination. An example of this is things like sheltered workshops. So in the US, and I think in a few other countries, but the US is the example I know best, there exist these things called sheltered workshops, and they employ exclusively disabled people to do very often menial tasks, but tasks that are necessary and that businesses profit from, things like packing boxes and so on and so forth. These jobs in these sheltered workshops are legally allowed to be paid below the minimum wage, and a number of these disabled people will be paid like $1 to $3 an hour because it's viewed that because they are disabled they are less productive. The problem is that they are a necessary part of this business, right? So they should be getting paid as if they were. This is something that forces disabled people into poverty, and also disabled people are more likely to experience other forms of employment discrimination, like just not getting a job because they are disabled or not being provided accessibility or adjustments that they require in their job to do it properly. Then there's a lack of access to equal education. So even where we have, for instance, segregated schools for students who are disabled, those schools are less likely to offer the same level of qualifications that mainstream schools have. And that provides those students much less access to things like university education if that was something that they wanted, because they are unlikely to be able to access the qualifications necessary for that. And then just finally, that there is an interaction between disability and other marginalizations. Number one, because progressive spaces, like places, like LGBT groups, for example, often don't necessarily prioritize things like accessibility. And that means that disabled people have difficulty going and interacting, with other community groups related to other identities that they have. But also that there is obviously places where the marginalization can combine in a particularly negative way. So an example would be that Black people are more likely to experience police brutality, so are disabled people, and thus Black disabled people experience a significant risk in that kind of situation. Let's then talk about how we would talk about disability in debates. I'm just going to take a drink for a second. So I think firstly, there are a number of debates that just explicitly reference things like disability and mental health. And thus, it is kind of clear that having a knowledge of disability and the difficulties that disabled people face allows for a better, framing and impacting of your cases and analysis. So if we think about this first motion here, this House regrets the increasing trend of popular shows featuring neurodivergence as a central theme. If you know how neurodivergence is often misdescribed in the media and the kind of views that people who have neurodivergences like autism, for instance, where they disagree with cures and things like that have, then you can see potentially how these depictions are more likely to be negative or more likely to lead to positive change and more clearly characterize what that kind of thing is. If we think about this House would require deaf parents to send their children to mainstream schools for their primary and secondary education. If you know how deaf people are excluded and the specific access difficulties they have in schools, i.e. that schools that aren't mainstream are less likely to offer high-level qualifications, but that schools that are mainstream are less likely to be able to accommodate and even teach a deaf child properly, unless they're more likely to experience difficulties in their education or bullying there as well, then I think analysis that happens in that debate is clearly much clearer. And then finally, this House would allow mental health charities to sue media outlets for the defamation of the mentally ill. If you know just how liable mental illness is to be something that is stigmatized and how negative the effects that often is, i.e. how that means people with mental health conditions like schizophrenia and so on are unlikely to access healthcare, are worried about being more likely to be institutionalized, and so on and so forth. Then a knowledge of that stigma and how it affects them is obviously more likely to help you impact that motion. Secondly, there are lots of debates where disability is a relevant issue that comes up. So for example, there are debates where disabled people are an important actor because they're affected very significantly by the policy that happens. So if we think about this House would replace existing welfare systems with a universal basic income. Because disabled people are so likely to experience poverty, they're so likely to experience employment discrimination, but we also know that one of the legal issues that exists of protections of disabled people in the world is that things like social welfare are often cut or the assessment system is changed. That means that disabled people often lose access to them. Then you can understand why universal basic income might be a more useful policy. But similarly, if you can characterize why disabled people have particularly unique needs that wouldn't be covered under a universal basic income, you can characterize why it's a worse policy. And then if we think about this House supports job security legislation, I think if you understand how likely it is that disabled people are likely to experience employment discrimination, so even if that is outlawed, right, that doesn't mean that an employer doesn't give another reason to say why they didn't hire me because I'm a disabled person. That doesn't mean that when they do redundancies that they're likely to not pick the disabled person first. That doesn't mean that they are likely to provide accommodations for disabled people and see that as useful. For example, they might hire the person to avoid discrimination legislation, but not provide them accommodations until they quit. That's something that a lot of employers do. If you understand how that kind of employment discrimination plays out, you can better characterize that in that debate and explain why this kind of job security legislation is so important to disabled people as a marginalized group. So there are also debates where disability is a relevant impact because things like poverty or other forms of discrimination poor mental well-being are things that can cause disability, right? So if you are impoverished for a long time, you're more likely to develop significant mental health, medical conditions that are disabling. If you have poor mental well-being and you're more likely to experience a mental health condition, that would be disabling. Other forms of discrimination, for example, if you experience like a hate crime assault, etc., these are things that can cause disability. If you have a better understanding of what the issues that disabled people face, past just being disabled is hard, i.e. they are then likely to experience even more discrimination because of all of the barriers that disabled people face, and that's something that you can significantly more impact and make clearer why that's something that could be a significant harm. And then I think finally, the disability rights movement is just a good example of a social justice movement that has been able to get systematic change. For example, like I talked about before, the 504 sit-ins or the moves away from institutionalization and the independent living movement. I think the interesting thing about both the independent living movement and the 504 sit-ins is that there wasn't necessarily popular support or social acceptance for disabled people that existed before that. And as I described earlier, the action that they took in terms of doing the sit-ins was something that was for many people like physically precluded by their disability and incredibly difficult for them to do. So this is a good example of a social justice movement that had to overcome just like what would seem to be insurmountable barriers of just not having any public support and also similarly like physically being able to do the protest action and so on being something that was difficult. If you have examples of social justice movements that are able to overcome those barriers, then it's easier to explain, for example, why other social justice movements that have barriers might still be able to enact change. Cool. Finally, I'm just gonna see if anyone has any questions. There were some that were submitted before, so I can just answer those now, but I don't know if there's any more.
There's one question on YouTube, which is basically asking about whether you could share the slides after the session.
Yeah, I can do that. That's fine. I can send them to you if that's all right.
Yeah, that would be perfect.
Cool. Yeah, I'll send these slides to be put up. Cool. I'll answer the questions that were submitted before then. So someone asked why this lecture was called disability and not something like ableism or accessibility or people with disabilities. I think the main reason is that ableism, accessibility, and people with disabilities are specific subsets of the topic of disability. And so I didn't want, this lecture was more broad, and so I didn't want to just talk about one of those subsets. But what they were talking about was how they think that disability is a word that induces misconceptions about the abilities that disabled people have. So I think, firstly, I think euphemisms for the word disability that are not disability that are often used, so things like differently abled or special needs or additional needs, are not things that necessarily are things that communities of disabled people generally support, insofar as they're often language that is imposed by non-disabled people. And the reason that it is imposed is specifically to distance disabled people from their disability and the disadvantage that they face because of their disability. Because the reason that people have misconceptions about the abilities of disabled people is not because of the word disability. It is because they don't like people who don't look like them and who don't behave like them and who don't think like them. And so that is why disabled people experience that discrimination. It is kind of generally seen that euphemisms that distance from the word disability and distance from that disadvantage, insofar as special needs doesn't like clearly state that that person is at a disadvantage, differently abled definitely in no way characterizes that that person is a disadvantage. It is generally seen by communities of disabled people that using words that aren't disability is something that is done by non-disabled people to kind of cover up that disadvantage that disabled people face. I think disability isn't a bad word, right? It's a word that describes an experience, and I think it's a word that's like universally understood across the world. I think, you know, it isn't bad for me to have a disability, and I think it is important to me as an individual and to disabled people in general to specifically acknowledge that there's a disadvantage, because I think what they mean by a misconception about ability is that you want to like not acknowledge that disadvantage because that makes people think that you're completely incapable. But I think the difficulty is that I need people to acknowledge the disadvantages that I face, because if they don't acknowledge that I have particular access needs or things like that, then I can't be accepted in their space. I can't go there. I can't get support and things like that. And then I just wanted to note about identity first language. So why I use the phrasing disabled people and not people with disabilities. This is something that is contentious and is debated. So it's not, I think it's a personal choice whether you, as an individual disabled person, would say disabled people or people with disabilities. But I think specific communities of disabled people have specific attachments to identity first language, because it is viewed that person first language, so person with disability, is something that non-disabled people started to say was PC, because it's like, you're a person, you're not defined by your disability, and it's to distance disabled people from the disabilities that they experience. But that is seen to be another method of covering up the disadvantages that disabled people face and enforcing that disabled people should prioritize first pretending to be like able-bodied and neurotypical rather than and rather than actively identifying with their disability and seeking adjustments and things like that. So that's why I personally use that language, and it's something where other people might make the choice to use person with a disability because they would rather distance themselves from their disability, or they don't see it as an important part of their identity. And I think that's a personal choice that is valid, but I just wanted to clarify that that's why I personally use that. The second question that someone asked was whether I had any tips for CAs about setting motions about disability. And they specifically said, is there like a checklist or a rule of thumb? I think in general, you should educate yourself on disability issues such that you can know whether things are appropriate or not, in the same way that we educate ourselves about other issues in the world to decide whether other motions are comfortable to set. But also just because like you have a like moral obligation, right, to learn about disability and actively participate in ending the discrimination that disabled people face. So I just think maybe like education is probably the most important thing. I think that's listening to disabled people's organizations. I think that's reading things that are written by disabled people. But I also think it's like when you see policy changes in your country, like changes to social welfare, you see disabled people mentioned, but maybe not mentioned very often, thinking about what the impacts on disabled people are there, and thinking about what their voices are saying, even if that's maybe something that's hidden. I think in general, in terms of rules of thumb, so minority groups are all different, and obviously there are some motions that are acceptable to talk about one minority group, and there are some motions that are not acceptable to talk about that minority group. But I think in general, as a rule of thumb, if you're setting a motion about disability, think about whether it would be appropriate to set that motion for another marginalized group that isn't disabled people. So an example would be if we're talking about things like some kind of enforced medical treatment for some kind of specific group of disabled people, like deaf children and so on. There's a few motions about that. Setting motions that enforce that, for example, an LGBT person must be heterosexual, and like that, you know, and being LGBT is something that is erased, is something that would be unacceptable. Those are motions that we have previously decided are homophobic and are unacceptable to set. So that's maybe an indicator that motions that are about, you know, removing disability in some way from an individual is probably something that also might be uncomfortable, at least for some groups of disabled people. And thus you should think strongly about whether it's okay to set. Obviously, there are some places where some of those motions might be okay, but you should consider it to be a more sensitive issue if it's something that would be insensitive for another group of people. I think, secondly, think about whether it's a debate that disabled people and communities of disabled people have, or whether it is a debate that disabled people have against non-disabled people. So debates about things like cures, things like the prioritization of carers in narratives about disability and things like that are things that are debates that are non-disabled people have against disabled people. So disabled people have a majority opinion that something is not okay, and non-disabled people have a majority opinion that it is okay. I think if that is the case, that motion is probably unacceptable to set, because the debate that you're having, you know, like, is specifically a debate against the voices of disabled people, right? It is you know, specifically about not listening to a minority group and doing something else. So that's probably an area where maybe not that you couldn't set it, but definitely that it would be an incredibly sensitive topic to set, and something that could be likely to offend disabled people who are in the room or leads to particularly offensive argumentation. So that's maybe an area to think about, you know, when you're setting motions. There are obviously debates, things about like models of disability and what the disability rights movement should do and priorities and so on and so forth, that are debates that disabled people as a community have. And thus those kind of things are probably the most acceptable debates, right? It's the same way like the feminist movement has debates about whether Me Too was good or was effective or whatever. And we can have debates about that. You know, we can have debates about things that disabled people discuss, whether that thing would be effective or positive change, or things like that. But I do think in general, it is about education. And I think if you're setting a motion where you don't have the educated position to know whether or not someone would find it acceptable, then either you need to do the research before you set that motion, or you need to not set the motion, or you need to consult a disabled person, or, you know, for whatever group that you're talking about, like a person of that identity, to find out whether that is something that would be acceptable or reasonable to debate about, if that's not something that you have the experience or knowledge to understand. Yeah, I think those were the two questions that were submitted. So if there's any extra questions, I can answer them, or if there's not, we can finish it up. If there's no questions, then I think we can finish up. If anyone has any questions afterwards, then feel free to message me and I can try and discuss them with you and answer them. But otherwise, thanks so much for having me. And I hope that people have benefited from this lecture.